Welcome back. We're very happy to have you with us. We are doing our second video this week. We're doing one for Year A, which we've already done, and this one for Year C, because there's options this week for these readings. So Jen is going to read from Luke's Gospel, The Prodigal Son. I think you might have heard this one before, but if you haven't, it's fine too. We'll explain it.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to listen to Jesus. But the Pharisees and scribes began to complain, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So to them Jesus addressed this parable. A man had 2 sons, and the younger son said to his father, "Father, give me the share of your estate that should come to me." So the father divided the property between them. After a few days, the younger son collected all his belongings and set off to a distant country, where he squandered his inheritance on a life of dissipation. When he had freely spent everything, a severe famine struck that country, and he found himself in dire need. So he hired himself out to one of the local citizens, who sent him to his farm to tend the swine. And he longed to eat his fill of the pods on which the swine fed, but nobody gave him any. Coming to his senses, he thought, "How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food to eat? But here I am dying from hunger. Shall I get up and go to my father, and I shall say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as you would treat one of your hired workers.'" So he got up and went back to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father caught sight of him and was filled with compassion. He ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son." But his father ordered his servants, "Quickly, bring the finest robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Take the fattened calf and slaughter it. Then let us celebrate with a feast, because this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found." Then the celebration began. Now the older son had been out in the field, and on his way back, as he neared the house, he heard the sound of music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what this might mean. The servant said to him, "Your brother has returned, and your father has slaughtered the fattened calf, because he has him back safe and sound." He became angry, and when he refused to enter the house, his father came out and pleaded with him. He said to his father in reply, "Look, all these years I served you, and not once did I disobey your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat to feast on with my friends. But when your son returns, who swallowed up your property with prostitutes, for him you slaughter the fattened calf." He said to him, "My son, you are here with me always. Everything I have is yours. But now we must celebrate and rejoice, because your brother was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. It's interesting. I heard a joke about this years ago, this story, but I'm not going to tell it. But it was this very similar to, well, it's a good joke, but it's very similar to the story I am going to tell, because George Foreman died last week on Friday, and I love George Foreman. But one of the things that he said, he was talking about when he made his comeback after 10 years into boxing, he quit boxing, became Christian, and then became a preacher, and it's worth investigating his life, because it's an extraordinary story about his conversion, because he was this terrifying guy who became this, the one that smiles and laughing and sells grills, and then became champion of the world again. So he was, in his comeback, people were all just saying he was a joke. This one scary guy is not going to be anybody anymore. He's fighting bums. And one of the things someone said about me is, how can he be the prodigal son of of boxing when he looks like the fattened calf.
Oh, jeez.
And he was like, yeah. And what was the other one they said? He was telling all these, and he goes, there's no way he's going to ever be champ as long as his training camp is anywhere near a Baskin Robbins. And he was telling that all these people were making fun of him because he was so great. Big George was his name. But it's this idea that the story that we look at these characters in the story, and the joke that I was going to tell you was that the character that has it the worst in the story was like, oh, the older brother, the younger brother, the father, and then of course the fattened calf had it the worst, the whole thing in the story. But anyway, we have this very familiar story with all these different characters in it that we can relate to. And maybe even some days the fattened calf, we feel like we're getting that kind of treatment. But the father, we understand. We can understand. The younger boy, many of us have been there when we've had to return home and say, I'm sorry. And it doesn't have anything to do with your age either. Sometimes that's just the way it feels. And then then that even though we were that younger brother, we identified with that younger brother maybe at a different time in our life. Maybe now the older brother is the one that has a struggle similar to our own. I know that people who are regular churchgoers, people who are involved in church and religion, and people who are involved in their parishes might fall into this feeling of entitlement, which is a little bit stronger of a word than what the older brother has, but it's appropriate. Might fall into that. How come you didn't let me have a fattened calf for my birthday? And then your son comes back and he's been a sleazeball, and you put the fine linen on him. Well, what's the matter? We understand that older brother, and yet how often does that older brother situation fall into our life when we have conversations about who should be doing what, or who is worthy, or who should be thrown out, God forbid, of church. Those kinds of things creep in because we don't like to give our seat up. That's another one. You have people who sit in the same seat every week, and then at Christmas someone sits in their seat, we knock on wood, we haven't had a fight at Christmas in several years, but it used to be a regular occurrence, and in many parishes you do have that. You have some drama attached to, this is where I sit, this is how it's done. And the phrase I've been using during Lent for people, and I use it a lot with myself in my own thinking, is, when we get to a point where we want to make our preferences the law that everybody else has to follow, we might be getting in touch with the older brother from this parable in each of us. It might be getting to a point where okay, you don't know everything. So I was in graduate school for liturgical theology, and it's much more than when to sit and when to stand, because there's other people who know that stuff better than I do. I'm much better with the why and the for what reasons and what's going on, how does this text relate to that, or what's the history of these things. I'm much better at telling you why we might have a practice, but no one asks me any questions about any of these things. So it's interesting is but the whole point in the liturgy is that we're unified, that we do the same actions, at least by region, that we do everywhere, so that we kneel in the same place. And typically is not a problem, but when it comes to things like little things like, how to go to communion, and going to communion is the important thing. How you go doesn't affect what you receive. You still receive Jesus Christ, whether you receive on the hand or directly on the tongue. And the church permits and encourages us to go, understanding that the important thing is who it is we're receiving, not how we're doing it. We always say that however you receive communion, you receive it reverently, hungry. That's my thing. I love to say that. How should you go to communion? Hungry. You want it. By the way, that's another George Foreman line. He said that's the thing you need to win. You need to be hungry. You need to be hungry. He grew up poor. He was always literally hungry. Great big guy. He was always literally, so we can't give him too much of a grief about eating well. But at the same time, that hunger for Christ, that hunger for it is the most important thing about that. And that's just one of the practices that we could use as an example. St. Ambrose, my favorite quote, so that I don't offend anybody, when I'm in Rome, I do what they do in Rome, what the Romans do. And we use that expression to this day, sometimes in a bad way. but we remember that the liturgical teaching that makes us and keeps us one. So we can avoid these kind of older brother things at Mass itself. We can avoid that by when you go to a place, you do what they do. So I know I'm focusing a little bit on the older brother, but I think it's the most challenging for us. The younger brother has to have enough courage and to say, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that to you, Father. If you walk up to somebody, or a parent that may have a lot of money, and you say, "Give me my share of the inheritance now," you're kind of saying, "You're dead to me. I just want your money." It was an awful thing to say, an awful thing to ask. And right at the beginning, you're kind of like, okay, and he gives it to him, and then he squanders it. But the great last line of this is something we can't forget, that he says to the older boy. He goes, "But your brother was dead, and now he's alive again." So we have to celebrate. And any person who comes into our churches, any person who we meet in need, any person, we don't judge them for the reasons they're in need. You're like, okay, it could have been very much the case. My brother brought this on himself, right? By being dumb with his money. Also being cruel to you. My brother brought this on himself. But that's not what happens. And that might have been one of his thoughts. But the father, again, reminds the older boy of the most important thing. He was lost, now he's found. He was dead, now he's alive again. Those are monumental lessons for us. Any person who enters our door, whenever they come in, should be welcomed. We should be welcoming them into the same great life that we ourselves have entered into. And it should be our great desire to share that with people. So if there's some resistance in your heart to those kinds of things, let it be challenged, especially based on the greatness of this teaching today. Okay, I've given you everything from boxing and insults about George had in memory of him. But I also would remind you again, especially there's an Oxford lecture that he went and did, that Foreman went and did, and it was you can find it on YouTube, and it's just great because he tells the whole story about his whole life, and it's very powerful. And there's many other videos coming out now to worthy of watching since I brought it up. But thank you for watching, and have a great week. We'll do week 5 in the next few days, and we'll see you for that.